Welcome to Size of Thoughts, Conversations with the Alliance of History graduate students. My name is Jacob Glicklick, and I'm the producer of the show. The things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. All opinions and quotations in no way represent River West Radio. They are the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is therefore not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So thank you for tuning in. Joining me tonight are first-time guests, Matt Hall.
Oh.
Guest Matt Hall.
I'm on now. Okay. Hi.
Hi. And Stephen Kalagivani.
Hey.
Hey. So, as longtime viewers of the show will know, we've talked as grad students in different things, more about teaching than anything else. But I think for this point, focusing a bit more on kind of research that are all doing, which, given sort of the nature of it, lends itself to being, in terms of, has contemporary implications, has concerns with a lot of things talked previously about politics, power, state domination, resistance to the same, and it also becomes highly depressing because we wouldn't, I think, be historians if we didn't have some degree. It was a critical thing of it. So, in that context, I mean, we deal all I think different eras, in terms of centuries of it, locations, but we all in terms of talk about in terms of central political control as imposed majority outside of it. So, I mean, perhaps the way to run through of it, just giving the kind of the elevator pitch version of what we all study.
Go ahead, Matt, since you actually know what yours is.
Okay. Well, I study I guess broadly, the German anarchist movement between the First and Second World Wars, and specifically their involvement in the Civil War and Revolution in Spain. So German exiles living in Spain who fought in that conflict and were anarchists.
I'm still locking down a thesis topic. As anybody who's listening knows about graduate school, sometimes that can take a while depending on what you're doing. But I do early modern Europe normally, but I'm looking at issues of early imperialism and interactions between colonial powers and indigenous groups, and how specifically how those groups, how they influence gender and concepts and constructions of gender in both ways, how colonial power influenced indigenous gender constructions and vice versa.
And for myself, I'm looking at late 19th century British travel accounts of Russia, and particularly the gender discourse that's used in perceptions of Russia and various arguments made about Russian national character, and what I'll be arguing is ultimately a way by the British scholars to justify their own role in their own empire by being the sort of rational, objective, masculine, in terms of observers that figured out and could render judgments on the whole population. And I guess the topic becomes more specific by luxury of having been doing this grad school thing longer of it. So, but it runs, so it gets more and more in terms of a fine-tooth comb that they focus. Ask me again, even 5 months from now, will be more about the perception of specific cities and areas, in particular travelers, and we'll lose, sort of in a sense, become less and less connected with the broader context of it. But
and I was going to say, as you guys know, I should probably tell any listeners out there, though, is that what will probably come up tonight, too, is I had an old thesis, which was looking at heterodox Christian groups, particularly the Socinians in early modern England, and how they resisted institutional church power in England and Europe, but specifically in England. They were an anti-Trinitarian group that didn't believe Jesus was God. So that was
good. But we can also, I think, run with the new topic for a while, since it connects, in terms of the whole
both of them are resisting
empire.
Power.
Yeah. Well, that becomes a fairly broad thing. So I guess, talking.
No, I wasn't going to say anything.
Okay.
Sorry.
Misleading. Matt made a misleading facial gesture that made me inclined to believe it's about to jump into the topic. But okay, all right. So we're talking about nature of power in different. I think it was all different centuries and continents of this. I guess the big, in essence, it's things that are on the advantage of small group that are very much not an advantage for most of the people impacting them. I guess in topic of research, is there things that from the point like with stability of those systems or how they work as well as they do? I mean, what in terms of what makes the empires, the state? I guess asking myself also empires, in terms of function.
Well, I mean, I can talk about a little bit. The complexity of the imperial projects is impressive once you start studying it. Just, I mean, it wasn't just it. Often people associate, particularly if you're talking about Spanish or French or English imperialism in the New World, say, they really associate it with military power. But that was such a it's a first contact issue, and it usually ends up being an occupation issue where the military is always a fear factor there. But I mean, the complexity of the imperial mission to not only militarily restrain those that they're occupying, but also to culturally manipulate them into following some sort of culture of the imperial power itself. So not just gender that I look at, but I mean in classes we've talked about and things I've read throughout my research. I mean, just they ripped down every part of life and really destroyed any attempted to destroy any identifying features of the cultures that they conquered, and often to no avail. I mean, they sometimes influence them in some ways, but you always see a resistance from the other side, an impressive resistance that ends up holding on and really taking root, and is capable of some strong things when the people are united. Even the smallest group can end up influencing the colonial power. I mean, it's sometimes hard to see, but it can be done. So.
Yeah, and if I could actually just, since you brought up Spain and sort of the Imperial Project in the New World, my research is actually tied into that because Spain lost its last New World colonies in the Spanish-American War in 1898, and this sets off this sort of mass psychological break in Spain, especially in the military, and you actually that sort of the imperial project that had been executed in places throughout the New World, and then was later, brought to northern Morocco and the Spanish imperial project in that part of the world. The Spanish Civil War, by some historians' accounts, is really that imperial project and a very militaristic one, and it become a very militaristic one by the 1920s. It's that project coming home to the metropole, and so in sort of the power structure that Franco is trying to create, and sort of claiming that Spain had to begin with, and it was destroyed by the Socialist Republic and all of that in 1930 through 36. Franco brings sort of this militaristic, very religiously dogmatic, masculine sort of imperial project back to the metropole, and really views it as a reconquista from the colonies, from North Africa, using colonial troops and things like that to get rid of godless, un-Spanish, Marxist, Jewish Freemasons.
And it seems that the Spanish example, which didn't study in tremendous detail, but becomes sort of a particularly overt or draconian sense of, the connections between imperialism and nationality and any setup of it, particularly since it's overt military power, but it's also the ability to co-opt and, influence people into going along with a particular system of power is something that works with the nation state and works with empire in different ways, and it's worse, and it's different, at least insofar as it's worse to be in the colonies. But that these get formed around the same time. That there's not really a European nationality. I mean, certainly for Britain, is what we're most familiar with, or from France, in other words, that operates independent of official racism and projection over as much of the globe as they could take and hold.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, though, that's the Spanish Imperial Project was one of the earliest ones, and by the time that England and France, and in some areas, they were just as awful to what they did to their, the indigenous groups they encountered. But Spain is always, as being, well, all three of us, Northern European, it tends to be this thing where Spain always gets vilified because they're on the other side of the Pyrenees, they're the bad guys. Yeah. But
Africa starts at the Pyrenees.
We weren't as bad as them when we did our colonial projects. There's almost that excuse for the French and the English, but it is. But they kind of learn that, oh wait, we don't have to. the Spanish by that time were actually manipulating. They weren't just killing every indigenous population they came across. They were manipulating for labor, and the English and the French learned from that and used them as labor as well, which in history books where we color over things doesn't seem as barbaric, but it is. So just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, since providing the opportunity for a certain subsection of the population to assimilate and to wipe out their culture and replace it with their own of it, while still killing everyone that resists it, becomes the comparatively sort of even-handed form of empire of it.
Yeah.
Since it's giving a chance at existence for some people that were living.
We won't just kill you; you just you forcibly assimilate it.
Yeah.
So it's just the nature of the imperial project was always. I mean, it wasn't. There was no sense of evenness. And actually, somebody a book I read recently, it was by an ethnobotanist. He was talking about the imperial project in the sense of we always tend to vilify the Europeans and what they were doing, but he pointed out interestingly, particularly in the Spanish case, for the last 100 years before they really got into the New World, it had been constant war in Europe. I mean, the religious wars, and it had been an us versus them conflict constantly in most of those people's lives as they went over. And they were also power hungry, and I mean that's what led them there, and they were money hungry and they wanted gold. But it's interesting to conceptualize it in the fact that they had been raised and enculturated in a highly violent society, and they didn't even think of, oh, maybe we don't have to kill the indigenous people, maybe they'll work with us or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems the precedent for empire, or the way that each given empire of it is looking at the previous regimes of it, and then positing that to claim themselves as unique, a different civilizing one of it, not pursuing domination of the past. I mean, it becomes sort of the most obvious, but deserves to be just still most emphasized point of it, that in terms of the U.S. foreign policy, very much is not an empire because it is based on such notions of democratic expression and free market. Yeah, the British, as in terms of because they're based in terms of rationality and in terms of industry and science, and not the sort of primitive Catholic
we aren't
domination.
just missionizing them.
Yeah.
We're bringing them democracy and free market.
And even as I understand it, the Spanish position itself of it, as they were sort of an empire unlike any that had existed in the past, because they had in part like the missionary mission that they put in with it, that there was the evangel that we are converting people and bringing them their souls as well as sort of the gold, even though even directly how directly they, I don't know. Well, not that any of the group of it, well, in the sense that the people on the ground, cared necessarily about the justification. I mean, there's direct reasons and incentive for doing empire. However much people back in the capital will be writing the treatises and theorizing it at the ground level, arguably that matters less and leads into conflict with people.
We send our missionaries in first. They plant the flag, and then we come in with the state.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the places that's Hawaii of missionization and then occupation. And then you have in most of our holdings in Southeast Asia, it was missionization and then occupation.
Yeah,
and so it's.
And even the 19th century British context with India, where there is a religious element but less forceful, but even in terms of the kind of like the secular evangelical run setup, in terms of you have your idea of Indian civil service, and you will give them sort of the Western canon and the scientific method and the economic process, but people at the ground level, the administrators were more opposed to that. They didn't actually want people that doing their jobs and entering into competition. You have the parts of it where, in terms of people at sort of higher levels, were in some cases more accepting of some sort of token cases, whereas at the ground level it becomes, I guess, the basic contrast that led so many people to be sort of educated and then establish color lines for any degree of position in empire that created the kind of educated, radicalized nationalist class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess the other, Ingalls can push through this, but I guess probably maybe up the topic of resistance more, which including Matt's, since I mean it seems if we're talking about an anarchist group instead of it, we're talking about people that are defiant and are
it's just
what
resistance period is sort of I mean let's see.
So I guess, there's a lot of broad topic way of visualizing it, but I guess in all the aspects of things that are like kind of studying or classification, taking like where is there points where were like most struck by people that were able to be actually effective. Where I mean, despite the like incredible lopsided imbalance of power, but
Effective.
well, maybe. Well, again, anarchists maybe we're not talking to, or things that are revealing unsuccessful attempts. To settle it. And I guess same question to I guess for Steve and for myself in imperial context. Although actually, and sort of depressingly, I study actual process of pushback far less. I've become more interested in what the travel accounts and how they frame the whole world in imperial vantage point. And
it's one of those inherent problems of history. It's often hard to get the voice of the resistance within the documents we look at.
Yeah. and the way I've done dissertation topic, I've optimized it to be studying the kind of callous, racist, misogynist real bastards to find out that they are callous, and hopefully in the context sort of revealing aspects of how the power dynamic worked. But I'm aware of it that in this context of the British Empire there are, in terms of the better side of it or the somewhat more moral side. It's not anyone that I'm going to be looking at as a source.
Yeah. Well, I guess one interesting element to me as far as just the sort of resistance in the anarchist context, and this goes not just for Spain or Germany but sort of globally where there are anarchist movements, is that a lot of times the resistance against sort of that power structure isn't just against the state, quote unquote, or sort of reactionary powers, if we want to use that term, but also against reformist elements. And so, for example, in Spain, you have as much animosity between the anarchists and the socialists as you do between anarchists and the Spanish right, and so that a lot of it has to do with collaboration with the state and things like that. So that's sort of an interesting element to me, and a lot of that is rooted in the sort of the constituency of the anarchists, if we want to call them a constituency. That makes it sound like they vote and things, which they don't always, rarely. But a lot of it has to do with their power base being in sort of the lowest of the low in society. So unskilled laborers, women in Spain are fairly involved in the anarchist. I should say they're really involved in the anarchist movement. So people whose chances of benefiting from any sort of reforms to the state are pretty low. And you can see that even, I guess, well, in the U.S. today, we have, our society has, advanced, and you hear people talk all the time, unions did what unions needed to do, and
now they go away.
They can go away now because they got us all this, and I'm like, well, talk to the person working 3 jobs in the service industry, those people at that level of society now. Their position hasn't changed thanks to all of the reforms put in place by reformers. And so in places like Spain or Italy, briefly the United States, Argentina, you had a strong anarchist movement that sort of picked those people up and at least for a time turned them into a real force to be reckoned with, and gave them a sense of purpose and a way to exercise agency, I guess, effectively.
Yeah, and also, including, at least in the Spanish context, like military agency, which becomes, what I think is interesting, particularly, talking about the gender concern, which you've sort of all brought up in different ways, because it seems that that's not, something broadly, in terms of when the image of the anarchist is constructed, in terms of it's not it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it tends to be sort of emphasizes for the youth, for men.
Right.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with our assumption that revolution is an inherently masculine idea too. In the masculine sense of our European Western formulations of masculinity, we like to look at it as that's masculine. Women wouldn't do that or something.
Right.
It's like,
that violence is something inherently masculine, and and I think the Mujeres Libres in Spain, the free women who formed their own militias and fought at the front and things like that. I mean, despite a lot of chauvinism from the men in the anarchist movement, I think there are plenty of examples of women who would dispute that assertion that violence is inherently masculine.
Yeah.
And I mean, in terms of for context of first wave feminism, even at the time, in people that were women that were setting terms of fire to members of parliament home and were being arrested and force fed. I mean, I think that becomes a tendency to, retrospective, like, well, to identify that as a much more quiet and passive and sort of negotiated process as opposed to contested one, which, like, I think at any change, whether for minor gains or substantial ones, that's something that is fought and that has, some degree, the violence and or threat of violence or threat to property of it that's used in different capacity.
And if not even an actual threat, it's a perceived threat due to the paranoia of a power class or something.
Yeah, there's that too.
The fear. You have a single slave revolution, and then you have the fear of the slave revolution everywhere. And even if it had the completely different cultures, I mean, the slaves in the United States developed a completely different culture. And I mean, there were slave revolutions here, but it was this assumption that, all black slaves were the same, so they were all going to revolt. It was just, you see this paranoia within the power structure of losing their power, and so there's an assumption of violence and property damage, even if the the threat in the local community isn't necessarily real or based on anything.
Yeah, and it seems that I think there are like larger patterns in terms of whether emphasis between those sort of historians of it who see the kind of the violence or the radicalization and the struggle being needed is for those who don't is depending what you see the basis of power. I mean, I think that you look to like the conventional history or like sort of like the progressive narrative. Let's simply learn from the mistakes of the past and build onward. It goes with an assumption that these major problems and exploitation are to some extent accidental or mistake. That it's people's ignorance or natural xenophobia that is making them just treat others in horrible ways, as in terms of opposed to, I mean, in terms of empire, in terms of the state, nationalism, slavery makes economic sense in all cases of it. There, I mean, it functions not, I think, sort of because of innate human depravity, or in terms of, or just in terms of animosity or sort of irrational, they're harming themselves by doing it. I mean, no, they're benefiting themselves, so that becomes the whole point of it.
And I think the biggest thing about the progress narrative is that it itself is a tool of empire. I mean, the whole project, the whole historical project originally was a tool of empire. I mean, it was used to justify imperial rule and colonial power, and it was the idea that the West has progressed to this point due to our little mistakes that we fix now, to the point that we have the right to rule over everybody. I mean, that's the justification, that's the progress narrative. And I mean, it's a biased interpretation of the progress narrative, but to some extent, I mean, it holds true of the time period it was developed in. So the progress narrative is itself inherently problematic because it is itself a product and it's meant to shore up the power structure. Yeah. So
I guess that it shores up the power structure not just by all right, everyone, therefore grab your in terms of rifle and go out and civilize civilize the savages and bring in terms of Bible and free market democracy to them, but it is a really good motivator for passivity, for non-involvement, for simply going along and being probably sort of tangentially involved or even aware. But when you see colonial crackers in terms of go in, you sort of buy that as tend to be a generally good thing.
You convince people. You convince the populace that what, due to our progress and us being better, no matter what we do, it's probably going to be in the greater interest of the people, no matter what it is, and so people are lulled into passivity. They no longer think they have to be involved because obviously we've progressed to the point where we don't need to be involved or something. I really don't understand the mentality because I don't have it. So it's kind of it's hard to conceptualize. But I mean, I know I've met and talked to friends, people I would consider friends who have this passivity notion of the political process. Like they don't. It's not even necessarily that they're resisting it. Not in the sense of like an anarchist resisting the structure itself, but they're just they don't think it matters. And I mean it's arguable considering corporate influence and stuff that it doesn't, but it's just an idea that they've almost been lulled into this sense of passivity due to our narrative, our historical narrative, that we don't need to because the United States isn't all that bad.
Yeah.
we usually do it for the greater good. I mean, I've met those grad students who I've met who have who still have that concept. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that becomes just and the fact that, in contrast with other empires or other forms of it, I mean, it becomes a somewhat subtler or like it's less attached to the direct symbol of empire. But even at the time, I would say that the more successful, by their own sort of standard empires that were not always establishing the Raj and putting the flag directly and making a routine process of dealing with rebellions each year by demolishing the villages in question. In some cases, the more effective one is in terms of the indirect empire, you have native puppets that secure in terms of foreign policy and trade relation and military bases, etc.
Right.
You can identify it from the broader notion that you're doing sort of expanding civilization and industrial development for the population, even if and if that's implanted as an ideology and made extensive across the culture, it becomes unmoored from actual evidence. The fact that you don't need to look at the fact that actually, year by year, standard of living is not improved any more than
No.
as long as you keep the facade going, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Because people, and it's a generalization. But people tend to not like digging into issues, and it takes time, and it's a commitment, and you have to look into information, and you actually have to research things. But
And you have to be willing to challenge currently held assumptions. Your own.
And if you aren't, and if that's not just part of what you do, it's often hard to see past that facade that's created by really powerful people that have put in, and it's I don't know, it can be hard sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, we're kind of as being highly educated and having access to easy information and readily accessible information is
Time.
It's a privilege, and it's something that not everybody has, and the time to do it. So.
Ah, class privilege.
Yeah.
We have now come to that.
well, yeah, it's,
Somewhat.
Yeah, a little.
Okay.
I mean, I think it becomes difficult to untangle from any of the context. I mean, if of what are looking for. I mean, and particularly I think in the consciousness that comes from different kinds of class privilege and in terms of class exploitation, in terms of the types of information sources that are aware of. So I think it was like Orwell's had an essay in early 20th century where was I think unusually honest about the process of empire. That so if in terms of socialist government comes to power of it and actually does let India remove itself, it will the result of that would be a hit for economy and degree of standard of living, even for in terms of regular working Englishmen. It's not simply it can't simply pretend the way the more left-wing parties universally were. That this simply will in terms of punish in terms of the corrupt rich imperialists of it. That imperialism actually goes wider than that, and actually that even it was positioning the reason that it would be politically impossible for anyone to come to power with that kind of argument. I mean, however, it's sort of like the necessary.
Well, I mean, we as we benefit from the American imperialism. I mean, no matter what even though we don't like it, we still benefit from it, and it's hard to remove yourself from that context.
Yeah.
It's hard to figure out ways, and you resist. Even if you resist that, you're still benefiting from it.
Right.
You can't really. I mean, unless you go live in the hills in a commune or something. But even then, still that you have the ability to do that.
Right.
Is the fact that we've solidified ourselves this little.
Which ranges the other. I mean, I think at a level of awareness of that and self-scrutiny. I mean, it might even just sort of day-to-day life means sort of less comfortable. The course of lives becomes necessary if we're going to actually have any kind of larger project or sort of influence that matters. I mean, I think doubly so as going to in terms of public education, where I would sort of also feel a sense of like, so I'm in terms of anarchist state employee again. Isn't it nice how that kind of works out? That at some level it's taking it's taking the system board of regents and tuition fees of it and governors sort of money of it to then push in my own sort of research and project. But by that same token, I think that's point of the reason why I think can't expect. I mean, it is I think nice and like invaluable that we get this kind of bubble where we do get to have scholarship into the more wide-reaching structural reasons. It's come up to in some cases pretty pessimistic conclusions, but it's also likely that same token that it's sort of like tolerated because it's not likely to reach that many people or challenge things that substantially because it requires a certain degree of both wealth and a certain being plugged into the academic world, since academics become better at speaking to other academics who are not in almost any case people with in terms of mass audience or influence or connection to power. So so I guess in the sort of more sleepless nights, wonder how much of it becomes just this little self-cushioning bubble where we can look at the college campuses and teachers and books and say see this becomes a free society because people are able to say how terrible it is.
Yeah. Well, that's as far as I guess bursting the bubble goes. You mentioned earlier my experience at a activist training camp in the mountains of eastern Kentucky.
I was kind of referencing that. But
you referenced. Well, it was before we started.
Before the start of the show.
Yeah.
So you were at a number of times at an activist training camp in Kentucky, which
it was interesting because you would hear. We sort of assume that some of this, or at least I have the assumption sometimes that some of this jargon that gets used is it makes it harder to disperse that sort of information. And I think something interesting that happened with that was that there was a woman there who was 80. 85. She was very old and had lived in Central Appalachia her whole life, but because of constant contact with these sort of radicals, hippies, I don't know, she had started, she spoke to us one day just about sort of her life, and it was like buzzwords from Dr. Eichner's class. Some of the stuff that she was talking about, I was like, this was before I had Dr. Eichner's class, but still, I was just like, wow. You don't expect that. So there's definitely, I think some of that, we get this idea in our head that we can't, it's self-insulating and all of that. And I think some of it is that, it's good to spend, half your time outside the ivory tower sometime and just, get arrested, or whatever, if you're going to do that kind of thing, Jacob, or,
since, I mean, I think the reasonable point in that, even sort of terminology doesn't insulate as much as who we are in conversation with, or doing it. If our main energy becomes towards journals that have a very deliberately limited circulation, or books, even publishing books that are ordered. I think academic press is about usually 100, 150 is sort of standard. It's expected that it would be only for other libraries, and if there was people that wanted beyond that one to read it, it would be pretty difficult in most cases.
To even get
certain limited numbers.
Or it's just preposterously expensive.
Yeah. So $45 for one book, or
it was $95 for one of the ones I wanted. It was a single softcover. It's just it's the problem with these small. But you're right. It's where at the same time, while we may get through occasionally to certain individuals, I think we do more broadly restrict ourselves. But it also doesn't help when the right in this country is fundamentally raised rather effective, actually, at this point, challenge to academia, basically trying to render us obsolete by ostracizing us in the sense that they insult us as being just propaganda platforms for radicalism, and students buy into that. And
or as being elitist. Or in terms of being sort of critical of it by in terms of having this sort of nice for you in terms of educated sort of hippies of it that can tell us how all the things that we're doing and all purchases and all and our country of it is fundamentally wrong. So so it becomes this. So in connection with the defense of extreme elitism, becomes sort of anti-intellectualism that poses as being a sort of democratic. Well, look in the political process. They effort to play up people being stupider than they are.
It's like the plutocracy trying to convince people that we are the autocracy. It's like that we're the academics are the autocrats. That somehow academics have the ability to influence their checks. And influence their paycheck. So it's this reverse they're basically trying to create us as being the anti-democratic ones, the ones who are against the populace, against the public mind, and that, you know, the job, quote unquote, job creators are the ones who are actually, you know, the free open ones who are trying to encourage society and do all the things that we aren't, and actually
Innovating.
innovating, allowing free discussion. All we do is
Yeah.
we sit in our offices and pontificate to students who are forced to listen to us because they need that check in the block to move on. And it's just having grown up in a really the Bible Belt, actually, of California. I mean, I saw how pervasive and how effective this rhetoric was. I mean, in the small farming community that I grew up in, I said I was going to graduate school, I became the enemy. It didn't matter. I mean, and I'm not a radical in any sense. I'm probably, you know, if this group, I'm probably one of the more moderate ones, and that's just how I grew up. I mean, I'm becoming more radical, oddly enough, but it was strange growing up with that, where, you know, I had always wanted, I loved history from when I was little, and I always thought, you know, go on graduate school is what I want to do, and I was automatically, people would just at it. It was just, even my friend who grew up in a rather conservative household, his dad owned an oil company. I mean, he said he was going to grad school, and his uncle said, why would you waste your time going to grad school? You're just going to sit there and read and write, you know, what kind of elitist are you that you're just going to sit there? I mean, this guy sits in his office all day and makes exchanges on paper for oil, exploiting people in South America or something. And he has the audacity, because of this propaganda, to say that his nephew's not going to produce anything because he wants to go into academia.
Yeah.
So
Well, I had a similar experience with a colleague of my grandfather asked me what I was. This was before grad school. This was when I was going into undergrad, and he asked me, "What are you gonna do in under? What are you gonna do when you go to college?" And I said, "Well, you know, I'm gonna study history. You know, I'd like to be a history professor." Or I just said I'm gonna study history, and he says, "What are you gonna do with that?"
yeah.
I was like, "Well, be a professor one day," which is, you know, like that's not the answer people that ask you that question want to hear. They don't want to hear the
No. It's because there's this idea within the right that
it's not useful.
professors don't produce anything.
Yeah,
So.
which becomes, I mean, an effective tactic or riffing of rhetoric that's been sort of done, repeated, and, you know, in terms of part and repeated over channels and with sort of funding that is hard to combat, and also just becomes ironically grotesque in current context. I mean, given that how much current economy, or that, I mean, that this sort of capitalism, not even being our grandfather's capitalism, in that how remote a lot of what sort of people are talking in this transition from of it are from, like, the actual making of things, and how much in terms of, you know, the own buzzwords and sales and kind of the PR and the managing and massaging and reworking of opinion and presentation becomes central in terms of what makes for profitability, as opposed to, I mean, even the not even just the direct process of manufacture, which was, you know, always exploitative, but this still becomes, you know, it's even a sort of more distant and abstracted and fluid and you know, well, also probably fragile.
Right.
So I guess in this context, like the arguments against, in terms of passivity, and particularly against not even so much in terms of overt, you know, capital, you know, in terms of, you know, objectivist, you know, pro-capitalism is a moral good, or which happens, which, you know, to an extent, but doesn't, I think, motivate most of the people of it. But you know, but instead, this in terms of, well, this has become sort of the practical. This is necessary. This is, you know, probably believe, you know, this is that, you know, after all, U.S. isn't like British Empire or, you know, others of it. There are, you might have made, you know, sort of, you know, mistakes or problems. I mean, it seems like most people, like, would at least put Iraq invasion as, you know, a mistake or done by the wrong people for wrong reasons. But, you know, but we would still say that overall, you know, in terms of the benefits have to be done. I guess connecting that back to sort of areas of things that we're studying, in terms of how much it becomes a matter of not even just art of the, like, resistance, or, you know, contesting the consciousness of power in contesting direct arguments, but just kind of like this blind assumptions. I mean, that's not something I noticed myself. Partly just the sources I'm selecting, I am prioritized to notice this. That I think there are people that are haranguing endlessly on the glories of British Empire and the direct power and the moral worth and the racial inferiority of the people that either need to be colonized or wiped out. I mean, there's some anti-imperialist arguments from the assumption that, trying to civilize and uplift people is a waste of time, and that they need to be either ignored or exterminated. That working for kind of actual changes or to teach non-white people useful skills is a waste of time. But more than that, it's just the quiet consciousness of perceptions and the sort of marketing that makes, I think, empire become just sort of back in the corner of people's mind that don't have to think about too much. But if you do, it will be in a way that is either immediately favorable to you or has kind of set of loose arguments, that push for the basic that the British are trying to do the right thing in controlling large parts of the country. And I guess even in the context of the things that you studied, I mean, similarly, like, I guess the question of it is being like more implicit than explicit.
I think it's partially that a lot of working class people just don't have the time to think about it. I mean, that's also a major issue and an influencing factor that, when you're trying to feed yourself and your family, you don't have time to get involved in that. And especially something as large and as powerful as the colonial power structure. I mean, it's hard to resist. I mean, it took a long time for it to go away. And I think also another part of it is that it's not even that it tends in colonial studies to just recently to kind of focus on how colonial powers used positive aspects to get their people on board with the imperial projects. But I think there's also a sense in modern empire of pitting the working class against the people you're colonizing, in a sense, to get them to not actually realize what you're doing and to lull them into passivity. I mean, this is all opinion now. It's hard to talk on my research in that regard because that's not something I know it exists, but it's not something I'm familiar enough yet with to really speak to historically. But I think it's a big problem when we we make an economic empire where our economic influence is our power over other countries, and then we convince people, the power structure, the government convinces people in the country that then we have an influx of immigrants from usually the countries where we are influencing their economics and making their economies collapse. I mean, with a free trade act, you give subsidies to corn farmers in America. Corn farmers in Mexico can't compete anymore. They all go broke. And what do? They immigrate to the United States where they can do something and make money. And then you pit the working class against the immigrants that come in. And they're so busy worrying about the quote unquote immigration debate that they don't have time to think of like, we caused this problem. Our economic imperialism in this country and around the globe has caused a lot of the problems, and it lulls people into somewhat of a passivity that's dangerous, I think. Not everybody, but
If we got rid of NAFTA, the corn farmers could go home and manufacturing jobs would come back from the maquiladoras, and we would solve the problem.
Maybe.
Well, at this point, it's a start.
It's optimistic. But
I think that becomes. I mean, resist trying to see too much seeing world as contemporary things driven by vast right-wing conspiracy. Though I mean,
I'm not saying that.
In the sense they are, but I mean, in the sense it's not necessarily in the sense of like envisioned as let's form NAFTA and then use that as a setup. But I think
what evolves.
I think the distinction is, the same forces of the right that are pushing and see immense immediate profits in that form of it. Also, find. If the enormous amount of money and sort of funding and narratives that are done to cause people to, in terms of the incentive of anti-immigration hysteria in the country, that then becomes a way of focusing in terms of working class fear and animosity. So that even some contexts, even sometimes where people who also have perhaps a cynical view of corporations. I mean, I guess not everyone is in the same sense. The Tea Party that there's direct racism with sort of blind in terms of being funded as puppet wing for Koch brothers. In some cases, it is I think individuals or groups of it who are also contain some anti-capitalist or at least anti-corporate elements, but they also have strong, in terms of racist, in terms of take back country type setup, which, I mean, beyond like sort of I think tainting a lot of other things, it means that if you view both as a problem, if you view the multi-billionaires and in terms of the illegal workers swarming the jobs, I mean, which one becomes easier to fight or defeat? Which one becomes the way to pour out energy and anger against?
When you
So
create, and it's not even the sense of it. Yeah, definitely not a conspiracy. I don't mean that they actually have even the foresight or the organizational aptitude to do something of that scale, but more so that both sides in this country are really good at picking up on bandwagons, and instead of just jumping on the bandwagon, they jump on the bandwagon and grab the reins, and they just make it their own. So
That is a good-
you see the immigration people are resenting something, the idea that they're taking our jobs or whatever it is, and then you see the right jump on, grab the reins, and say like oh, these are all illegal aliens. Oh, don't call them undocumented workers. They're invading our country, and we need to. They're all drug dealers, and they're all they advance the rhetoric to a point where it becomes a national debate that they can then gain a constituency from.
Right.
And so it's not even the sense that they originally lit the spark, but they're just fanning the flames. And
Right,
so and
right.
that's the sense of, and it's both sides. It's not just the right. I mean and it's not the left necessarily, but I'll say the Democrats.
the other right,
saying
the other right,
the other yeah,
the lesser, the
the more right center-ish
Yeah,
kind of
Middle-ish.
group.
Yeah.
But so I think in the sense of that, I'll
Right.
clarify that it's not a
no.
conspiracy.
No,
Yeah,
I think so. No, but in some ways that lends itself as a more, well, I guess, conceptually fascinating and interesting and nuanced and effective. I mean, if it were conspiracy or simply was organized, directed, it becomes more fallible. But if it's a matter of just adapting a lot of different tactics get done, in terms of Republican talking points that are successful and start getting away over the ones that attract attention. So then there can be a context by which they sort of seem to be only succeeding over extended period and has a pretty significant cumulative impact.
Yeah.
And I guess so. Then, but in the context of the different kind of resistance of it, I mean, Matt, you talked a bit earlier, like with Spain, about certainly in terms of the push against, in terms of communist, partly, when they were being taken out and shot. I mean,
Yeah.
reason for anarchists, never had it hugely easy. But I guess also, in terms of bringing, in terms of some of more bottom level people of society into direct involvement where they're, I mean, if anything else, the form of mattered. Is there?
I think there's sort of two ways that the anarchism and I guess mass politics and resistance sort of occurred in Spain or interacted with each other. One is through syndicalism, which is revolutionary trade unionism. That was the big one in industrial areas, and that is that's probably the one that was the most effective in, say, resisting Franco and that sort of thing. And so, giving not only resistance, not just as setting up, not just as a I guess a destructive force, setting up an opponent to take down, but also giving something constructive. So, the syndicalists weren't just a union that would strike against capitalist business owners and eventually form militias and fight Franco. They also, offered sort of welfare services and things like that, and schooling, and eventually, when the revolution starts in 36, along with the Civil War, it's those groups that sort of set up a dual power sort of society where they're actually the ones running the economy and giving people a say that way. So it's constructive, it's not just destructive. And I think that's sort of the maybe the best example of sort of a good anarchist form of resistance, we'll say, as opposed to the occasional bomb throwing assassination that occurred.
Yeah,
also,
but,
that's the other.
Well, propaganda of the deed not being necessarily
Notwithstanding.
that much of a successful tactic.
No.
Tends not to be.
No.
Yeah, somehow people throwing bombs, it does not inspire mass converts to movement.
It does not.
Particularly not in this country, but yeah.
But runs
Anywhere, really.
Yeah. But which, again, I mean, I'll speak to the other point that if it's that's not us, is it?
I don't think.
No, it'd be further away.
Okay.
Okay, not someone calling about their headphones this time. But it's a community radio, everyone. But yeah, which makes sense to me given the imbalance of physical power that exists,
Right.
whether it's between sort of the state and sort of individuals, or certainly in terms of imperial state and colonized areas. Simply forming as a group of it. I mean, it becomes like the question of like the numbers game within it. But there's reasons why within a very coercive structure, not going to be able to have large amounts of people having outbreaks of mass violence or rising. And even if they did, often they're a case where they don't have the enough resources to win directly.
Yeah.
But in contrast, I mean, the building directly viable structures that are form alternatives to where the worst exploitation is, that are both sort of the part of the bridge and the foundation for further more extensive struggles, and also do matter and help give people a sense of mechanism of it. So I mean, I guess that suggests well, maybe that's something we should be doing more of as the way of.
I mean, that's
increasing.
I mentioned some of the stuff in Appalachia. I mean, that's sort of the classic way of handling resistance there. You can only chain so many people to bulldozers and that kind of thing. And it's not really cool anymore to set them on fire. Not suggesting that that's something we should be doing, but the way of resistance is communal. So building communities, rebuilding communities, because that's one thing that capitalism in the United States has been really good at, is destroying communities. I mean, there are still local places, but they're not communities anymore.
Which because once elimination of group identities, it forces everyone at the level of individual, becomes what every successful totalitarian model does, that makes compliance almost inevitable.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. All right.
So I think on that, well, I guess pessimistic note, but just before that, there was a slight point of optimism before. Like to thank again guests for coming out. Would encourage any viewers to hang around if you want to catch Killer Radio Show, and to check in again next week at Tuesday, where I'll be joined by Jason Kennedy and Joseph Walzer with more discussion of some of the politics of the publication of history in different modes, both academic and non-academic. So until then, another quote from our theme song, the Life of the Mind, and have a good evening.
Thanks.